So now we're going to look at the last part of the external structure of the eye. So again, I'm going to ignore the things we have looked at before, such as the pupil, the iris. So let's move on to the puncta. Now, this is the tiny opening in the inner corners of the upper and lower eyelids that drain the tears from the eye into the nasal cavity. We also have the lower eyelid. Now, remember in our previous slide, we mentioned eyelids in general, but in this slide, I want to break it down into the lower and upper. So, talking about the lower eyelid, now this is the bottom movable part of the eye that protects the eye and it helps spread tears and keeps the debris out. And then we have the palpebral fissure. Now, this is the opening between the upper and the lower eyelids, and it basically determines the size of the eye opening and also plays a role in blinking. And lastly, the other part of the eyelid is the upper eyelid. Now, this is very similar to the lower eyelid in terms of function, but the only thing it is that it's the top movable part of the eye and it covers and protects the eye as well as spreading tears and keeping out the debris. So, before we move on to our next subtopic, which is the iris, pupil, and lens, these are just a few key points that I want you to note. Firstly, the sclera is the white outer layer of the eye that you can see, and it's like the eye's protective shell. So it gives the eye its shape and provides a sturdy wall that keeps everything inside safe. Plus, it's where the muscles that move your eye are attached. And the cornea, so I want you to think of the cornea as the eye's clear front window. So it gets the light in and it acts like a shield, protecting your eye from dust, germs, and other harmful stuff. And it's the eye's first line of defense against the outside world. Okay, so now we're moving on to the iris, pupil, and the lens. So we have talked about this a lot in our previous slides, but um, okay, looking at the first diagram now, as I have mentioned before, the iris is the colorful part of your eye. So it works like a camera shutter, controlling how much light enters your eye by changing the size of the pupil. And then the pupil is the black circle in the middle of the iris. So essentially, it's a hole that gets light in. Okay, so it depends on the light. So if the pupil gets bigger when it's dark, okay, and meaning if there's less light, it will get bigger. And in bright light, so when there's plenty of light, it will get smaller in order to adjust how much light gets through. Okay. And lastly, the lens. This is located right behind the pupil and it focuses light onto the retina. Now, I want you to think of the lens just like an eye's autofocus. So it makes sure we see things clearly at different distances. So, and our second diagram over here, so it's just a closer look at the pupil, okay? So we've talked about the iris, the lens. So the anterior chamber, again, just to emphasize, we mentioned this in the exterior structure of the eye, but it's basically the fluid-filled space between the cornea and the iris. And the cornea, as we talked about before as well, is the clear front surface of the eye, okay? And we want to take a deeper dive into the uh, iris, pupil, and the lens. So um, I want to skip the cornea and the iris and the lens, but I want to move on to the suspensory ligaments and ciliary muscles. We did mention this before, but just to add on, it's the intricate mechanisms working together in order to adjust the lens so that we can see clearly whether we're looking at something up close or far away. Okay, and then the conjunctiva is, you can think of it like a screen protector. So it keeps your eyes moist and shielded. And then the optic nerve is like the data cable. Okay, so it transmits all the visual information to our brain, which then interprets it. And then the fovea, I think this is a new term. We did not mention it before. So this is basically the ultra high definition sensor. So it gives us the sharpest details of what we see. And the retina is the digital sensor. So it captures the light and turns it into signals that the brain can understand. Okay, so again, these are just some key things that I want you to know. So it's kind of like a summary. So you can pause the slide here and take down short notes if you'd like. So now we're going to focus on the layers of the eye. So as you can see in this diagram, we have three main layers. So the first one is a fibrous layer. Now this is the outermost layer of the eye. So it includes the sclera, which is the white part of the eye, the cornea, which is the clear front part, and the sclera basically provides structure and protection, while the cornea helps focus light into the eye. And then we have the vascular layer. So this is the middle layer and it's all about blood supply. So it contains the choroid, which is full of blood vessels that nourishes the eye. And the layer also includes the iris and the ciliary body. So the iris controls the size of the pupil and the ciliary body helps with focusing by changing the shape of the lens. And then the inner layer. So this is basically the innermost layer, which is the retina, and it's like the film in a camera. So it captures the light and it converts it into electrical signals that are then sent to the brain. And yeah, that's basically an overview of the layers of the eye. Okay, now we can see this very detailed diagram. So, but don't worry, we have actually covered most of the parts, so it shouldn't be too hard to understand. So, starting with the fibrous layer, as you can see, we have the sclera and the cornea. Um, so I have, I've already repeated this before. So moving on to the vascular layer, we have the choroid, the iris, and the ciliary body. And lastly, the inner layer, we have the retina. So this is kind of like a summary of the outer layer, the middle layer, and the inner layer. So basically, I want to provide some extra information. So talking about the outer layer, which is the fibrous layer, so it consists of the sclera and the cornea, as mentioned before. So the sclera basically forms about 83% of the eye surface and provides structural support and protection, and the cornea, which is transparent, makes up the remaining 17%. And it basically acts as the eye's main refractive surface, which bends the light to help focus it onto the retina. So the middle layer, consisting of the iris, the ciliary body, and the choroid, is also known as the uvea. Okay, so the iris controls the diameter and the size of the pupil, and the ciliary body produces aqueous humor. Now, aqueous humor is basically the fluid in the eye, and it contains the ciliary muscle. And what this muscle does is that it changes the shape of the lens when focusing on objects at different distances. And as mentioned before, the choroid is all about blood vessels and supplying nutrients to the retina. And it covers most of the back of the eye, so about approximately 85%. And then the retina, it has several layers of cells. So remember, the retina is the one that converts the light into the neural signals, which is sent to the brain. So it basically has photoreceptor cells, so rods and cones. So we will look at this in our next slides that basically detect the light. And then the optic nerve, of course, it transmits the signals to the brain. And although the retina is quite thin, it is packed with millions of photoreceptor cells.